And with that, you create a property right. And then, of course, what happens is that the thing gets not only propertized and capable of being owned and transferred, it also gets, as it were, its individuality disappears. It becomes a commodity. You know, it becomes something fungible. We are no longer interested in what's in it. We are no longer interested in how it came to it. The most interesting thing for the artist is the creative process. And in performative arts, the creative process happens with the performance itself, again and again, and that makes it so fascinating, because that's a living thing. But of course, that it cannot be owned and it cannot be controlled. So what happens is that the law simply says, oh, well, you know, we attach to these things, bits of pieces of these things, and turn them into normative criteria, which are then fixed pieces of some kind of intangible property. And that then leads to a quite good issue, a good situation for lawyers, because you don't have to worry too much about what is actually protected. You just see that as, you know, the property right as such, which can then be owned and you can get revenue. And this is particularly interesting, for example, for the record industries and so on, because it is essentially a way how you derive profit, kind of rentier system, as it were, but you don't really care what it is. You just care that it sells, and you don't care how it came about, and you don't particularly care whether it could change things and so on. So the creative process is frozen. You know, if you look at your cat and say, go this way, cat will just ignore you. But of course, if you kill your cat and stuff it, and you can pass it on, and it will do, it happens to be dead, but you can actually pass it on, and it works. And the same happens, of course, with the performative arts, which are sort of wrapped up into this concept of the property right. And that is essentially what the trick of the system is, and therefore it works perfectly well for those people who actually want to make money out of that. Sometimes that may be the artist him or herself by accident, but that is not really intended or necessary. The system is independent of that, and that is also why it was said earlier that sort of the incentive argument of copyright doesn't work, because it just sort of misses the point. You know, the copyright is actually not really incentivizing artists per se. It may happen that the old artists benefit from that themselves, but the actual thing is that you have a commodifiable and transferable piece of property like a house or a car, which you can then pass on, and somebody, may not be yourself, but somebody else, may actually get revenue from that as a royalty. And that is essentially, I think, what is behind the idea of copyright and how it copes with the idea of music. And it could cope with the idea of dance in a similar way. And the reason why it didn't do that is, I think, simply practical, because there's less money in dance and choreography. It will happen, and they will have probably the same problems. You will then have perhaps a sort of compulsory idea of, you know, video everything in order to fix it. That can then be sort of commodified in one way or another, and then you have got some transferable product. It's also very important from a management point of view, which you can then transfer, and which is, of course, ownable, as it were, and predictable, because the creative process has been frozen, has gone out of it. The sound recording does exactly that. This is past performances of music. It's not the music itself anymore. And that can be owned, that's predictable, and that is also why the record industry is, for example, so interested in prolonging their copyright term for the sound recording in order to get more money out of that. Of course, this is much more predictable than, for example, investing in new music, where you don't know whether that actually yields any money at all, and if so, when. This is sort of, I think, the system behind it, which sometimes attaches to the creative process a little bit, sometimes not, but it's actually not dependent on it, and doesn't really protect it, let alone care very much about it. And so, with this fudge, as it were, the law can see or perceive the phenomenon of music. A very, very limited view, of course, is a bit like, you know, an X-ray of a person, and thinking that this X-ray is the person. Of course it isn't. But I think that is basically the concept which stands behind the idea of copyright in music or in relation to music.
Well, thank you for that modest provocation. Now over to the composing and performing community to respond to it. Michael first, and then Steve.
Yeah, I'll just make a few brief observations. I think you do touch on all the key issues. I think there are probably as many views to IP amongst musicians and composers as there probably are styles of music, and it ranges from people who create music because it's a cathartic experience for them. They have to do it. They don't necessarily mind what they're thinking about further down the line. It's not even part of their thinking at the time is, gosh, I'm going to make a fortune out of this. It's quite often just something they have to do, and I think that's important to remember that as well in all this. I do think for many people, though, the score, particularly in Western music, is still held up as the most important thing. I even see this in the context of the RAE, which I was involved in, the music RAE, and this misunderstanding about, is the output the CD that I'm submitting, or is it the score that I'm submitting? So there is a dilemma in all sorts of ways in this one. It's interesting that where the score actually comes in the creative process. So for example, for a classical composer, it's basically the end of the work for them. It's not complete, unless there are revisions, of course. For many others, though, a notated score is something that comes afterwards. You write your song. If it starts to become successful, you might do a piano arrangement of it or a guitar arrangement, and that's seen as an addition to that process. So I think where the score comes in is a very important part in all of this. I think the recordings thing is also kind of complicated, because there are people who don't perform live. We know them as recorded artists. I guess Kate Bush is a very good example of somebody who, has amazing studio-based work, but doesn't really exist in a live context. So perhaps that doesn't quite square with the definition that you had. And I think that in itself also leads me just to think a little bit about the role of technology in music, because what has traditionally happened, I think, is that technology has helped composers compose. It has helped people perform, either through using technology to enhance or correct or all the things that go on, or assist performers. And it's also helped us as listeners through the whole dissemination of music through broadcasting or indeed portable devices. What I think is now really interesting is what happens in that contract between the composer, the performer, and the listener. And now we're seeing interventions of technology that are really starting to change those models in unpredictable ways, so that the relationship between the composer and performer is a more fluid one, a bit like a choreographer and a dancer. And in fact, the model you mentioned with the Merce Cunningham computer model, that's very interesting, because we see examples of that in music where live drummers are now starting to copy drum machines and other drum patterns that are almost at the edges of being impossible. But they hear them and they think, oh, I think I could do that. So we are starting to see very interesting uses of technology in the field, which I think, again, challenge questions of ownership and these models that we've been talking about. So.